Hi, everyone, and good evening, Kate, I'm guessing.
Hello, Azeem. It is so lovely to see you. I wish I were there in person, but I guess this is as good as we can do for now.
We will have to manage. Kate, I was saying to her earlier, how would you like me to introduce you, Kate? Because her bio goes on for a while. And she said, you can just introduce me as a professor at UCS Annenberg and a professor at ENS and a professor of Microsoft. So that just was doing an awful lot of heavy lifting, but certainly one of the smartest minds thinking about this wider question of technology and artificial intelligence in the context of power and politics. She's written about it in your latest book, The Atlas of AI, which I don't have a copy with me because you sent it to me electronically. There's a fantastic book, so I'll pitch it now. Beautifully written, very easy to read, very, very challenging, and we'll be exploring some of those ideas today. But thank you for being with us, Kate.
It's a pleasure, and thank you for joining us too.
Now, where I wanted to start was to just quote something that you told me a few weeks ago, and I've gone off and mucked up where I put the quote in my phone. Here it is. Okay, I found it. You said, we have to move away from this idea that artificial intelligence is an immaterial and abstract and in the cloud. We have to see it as a profoundly material technology, something that is made from the earth. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I've been a researcher in the space of AI for over 15 years. And if there's a consistent mistake that I see us making as a field, it's believing the hype that somehow AI is truly just abstract zeros and ones in the cloud, a series of sort of computational approaches that aren't really connected to all of the forms of natural resources, energy, water, layers of human labor that are required to make these systems actually work. So for me, certainly one of the sort of reasons for writing this book was while I've been really inspired to see the increased focus on things like AI ethics and fairness, there hasn't really been enough looking at these deeper planetary costs, these environmental and labor costs that really run through the entire supply chain of artificial intelligence.
We often don't think about the supply chain of AI. When we ask Siri for directions, we get a response, and they're pretty good responses today in 2021. But could you talk us through what actually happens? What has to happen for that query that I might put to Siri? How long is it going to take me to get to the Aga Khan Centre in North London and to get an accurate response? There's a lot of heavy lifting going on. So how should we think about that?
Well, I hear you had pretty serious traffic today, so perhaps Siri might have got it wrong. But well, I love this question because it's a question I put to myself actually as a researcher a couple of years ago in a project called Anatomy of an AI System, and in a collaboration with the artist Vladan Jola, we tried to analyze all of the things that it takes to make a single Amazon Echo able to respond to you when you ask a simple question like, "How's the traffic today?" And we started out by essentially looking at all of the data pipelines that certainly those of us in the industry know quite well in terms of natural language processing, sort of the input of the voice, and then how the voice is analyzed. But then we tried to widen the lens and say, what happens if you try to trace where every one of the components come from? If you go back all the way to the cobalt mines, to the lithium mines, to the smelters, to the container ships, and all the way through to the end of life of a device, which tends to be anywhere between sort of 3.5 to 4.5 years before they get thrown away in e-waste tips in places like Ghana and Pakistan. So this was a sort of a birth to death way of understanding the full life cycle of just a single voice-enabled command to a consumer AI device. And, speaking personally, that project, which, really got started in 2016 and was published in 2018, totally transformed me
Mm-hmm.
as a person thinking about these issues. It blew me away to learn just how much of a precipice we're on in terms of just these core basic components, these mineral components that we just assume are limitless, that drive everything from electronic vehicles to iPhones, but they're actually right now the focus of intense political debate, and of course are now looking at a very serious cessation of the supply chain unless we change the way we manufacture large-scale computation.
Well, the word cloud is lovely and fluffy, and I guess what you're characterizing is that below that cloud, it's pretty crunchy and spiky. We'll go ahead, please.
Well, no, just to agree with you. I mean, the metaphors are such a trap. The cloud is one, but artificial intelligence itself is another great trap, I think, as a term that I think has pulled us away from looking at these true material costs.
Yeah, well, you say that artificial intelligence is neither artificial nor is it intelligence, and I think it's worth unpacking that a little bit. I mean, what do you mean by that? Because when I hear that, I can roughly agree around the word intelligent. I mean, every time I talk to a researcher in the AI field, they make the point largely that they're quite far away from anything that looks intelligent. I was talking with Jeff Hawkins from Numenta yesterday. He made the same point. But the word artificial is a bit harder to grapple. It's more of a critical idea that you're presenting there, because prima facie it's produced by us, so it's artificial. I mean, it's not growing on trees. So what's your argument about why we shouldn't consider it artificial?
It's certainly in some ways, if we put it most simply, grounding this idea of artificial intelligence. So the artifice has so often meant an idea of an artificial black box that can function akin to a human brain. And as you say, most researchers now would be very clear that the intelligence really isn't intelligent in the way that we would recognize it in humans. But neither is this idea of artificial in the sense of quite separate from the material components that drive it. As you know, this is happening at a time when AI is moving further and further to intensive compute cycles. Right as we're sort of reaching the end of Moore's law, we're seeing AI systems that really require enormous amount of parameters and GPUs, that things like GPT-3, for example, leave a huge carbon footprint on the planet. So by challenging this idea of artificiality, it's really attempting to bring us back to the focus on what are these material costs? What are the humans in the loop who are actually making these systems? What are these limited resources from energy to water and beyond? And then how are we going to start to think differently about the lifespan of the sorts of AI consumer devices that we so easily purchase and then discard?
There are so many wonderful ideas in there that we're going to pick them off one at a time. But I just have a slight operational question. My timer isn't running, so I don't know where I am. Well, I know where I am, but I don't know when I am. So if that could get going, that'd be great. The one area I'd love to just spend a bit of time on, because I think we understand now that these things require chips and they require processing, they require data centers, and the data centers require cooling and so on. But the human side of the supply chain is quite interesting. You talked about the fact that e-waste goes off to other countries to be sort of dismantled. We've been doing that with our waste for a long time in the richer parts of the world. But talk about the human labor used in essentially teaching these not very bright machines.
Well, it's interesting because, of course, it happens at multiple parts of the production cycle. So certainly we know a lot about highly paid engineering labor, and there's a huge fight on trying to, hire the best machine learning engineers who are getting paid salaries, the likes of which, the top basketballers can command right now. But it's the forms of labor that we don't see, what scholars like Mary Gray and Sid Suri have called ghost work, sort of the ghost laborers, who are often the people doing the low-paid digital task work, really, of things like labeling data for large-scale AI systems. And this is happening in places in rural America, in India, in Malaysia. There are entire cities that are dedicated to labeling data, in China, in fact. So it has become this kind of back-end system that requires so much work, often done on remote work platforms like Amazon Mechanical Turk. But also there are other forms of work that we don't see that are used to kind of prop up systems. One of the examples I use in Atlas of AI is a personal assistant AI that was produced by XAI that claimed to be artificial intelligence. It was, in fact, people who were responding to your emails and trying to organize your calendar. So again, we see this time and time again. There's this fantastic term that the writer Astra Taylor uses called photomation, this idea of fake automation. It's extremely common. And again, it gives you the impression that AI is somehow autonomous and objective and separate from humans, when in fact it's all very much embedded. And some of the conditions under which people are sort of propping up AI are actually extremely exploitative. So really bringing in these questions around labor rights, it's certainly overdue for that reckoning in the field.
Yeah. Well, I think we can agree on that question of labor rights. One of the things, though, that strikes me about data labeling platforms moving out into emerging markets is that what it does do is it brings novel management disciplines and access to these new technologies into those markets. What we saw in India during the 80s and 90s, when the outsourcing movement started to grow, and NASCAR famously sort of organized the Indian outsourcing industry, and we saw sort of Tata and Infosys growing, was they started on the sort of mind-numbing side of data entry. But in winning those commercial contracts, they moved, to use a hideous business term, upstream. And now Tata and Infosys will compete with the likes of Accenture and Deloitte for global strategy and technology implementation business. And the foundational point was you started with the grunt work because the rest of your economic structure didn't support those industries. We saw something similar happen in China with manufacturing, when Huawei started from being a kind of a cloner of low value products to having the best 5G stack in the world. So isn't there an argument to say that even if the work looks menial and mind-numbing at this point, to be labeling photographs of cats and not cats in Ghana for some Y Combinator startup in Silicon Valley, that creates a foundation that in a few years turns into local development centers, local software businesses, more complex businesses?
Well, certainly you're making an argument that has been made for many years around trickle-down economics, and that certainly industries will slowly benefit from becoming industrialized in new ways. However, I would point you to the way in which we're actually looking at the asymmetries of wealth really becoming extreme, specifically in the case of AI. So if you look at the amount of money that's generated by, say, the top 6 tech companies in the world versus how much is actually held in those companies that are doing, say, for example, data labeling, the difference is absolutely staggering. And this is something, again, that I researched for Atlas of AI, just looking at the difference in what you get paid per day as a data labeler versus, for example, a top Silicon Valley engineer. Now, you might say that this type of work is so much more valued. Well, it's very hard, I think, to make that case when you look at just how wealthy the very, very top sort of executive level is now in AI versus the amount. And we're talking about many, many, many thousands of people who support these systems who will never actually benefit. Yeah. So certainly from a purely economic perspective, I think I would challenge that idea. But I think the other thing we have to think of is not just who benefits, which is, again, a very small handful of people, particularly if you compare it to, say, the industrial history of Ford and the sort of production of cars, but actually looking at who is harmed. And this is where we see the real concerns in terms of, again, it being the most marginalized populations who are bearing the greatest costs. And that's true at a sort of individual and a community level, but it's also true at a level of geopolitics. And you can look at which nations are becoming the most enriched and which ones are actually seen as the AI client states. And so here I think we have, again, a geopolitical story, which is about increasing concentrations of power and wealth. And that asymmetry is something that many people, from economists to social scientists to now even people in the tech field themselves, are pointing to as a real point of concern.
Do you think that this arises from some particular attributes of the way we currently build the technologies and the way in which advantage confers as this idea of the data network effect, that you need to get a slight lead in the amount of data you have to build an AI system, which then compounds? I mean, does that underlying process contribute to the problem that you've just described to us?
No, I love that you're putting straight to the point of this question of the way in which who has the data pipelines will always be enriched by increasing information and therefore, increasing perspective and increasing power. Certainly at the level of technical design, we can say that machine learning is a winner takes all loop. But it's more than that as well. And I think that's when we have to move outside of a purely technical analysis to look at what's happening in terms of law and policy. So certainly regulation has really failed to keep up with what has been happening in the tech space. And one of the things that's been interesting, of course, is to see the EU release its first omnibus regulation for AI. Now, of course, the US is nowhere near this. Australia, in fact, just recently produced its first document attempting to come up with a new regulatory framework for AI. But essentially, the US is still very far behind. So it's actually in these areas that I think we can say we need the most innovation, actually, is at the level of how do we think about law and policy.
Which is a great segue, because I think that is this is one of the questions that has that I've explored as well, the gap between the law, the value, the set of institutions that are informal, and the potentials of the technology. But I'm curious, given that the technologies by their nature always move ahead of lawyers and lawmakers. This is not to disparage them, it's just the nature of technologies. If they moved slower, they wouldn't be technologies. What actually needs to happen? I mean, what are the prescriptions that are required to tackle the sort of material footprint that you describe of the planetary scale of AI?
Well, I know this is something that you and I have talked about, and I'm going to flick the question back to you as well, because I'm going to be very curious how you answer it. But certainly we need to think about governance in new ways.
Right.
And there's been a lot of work that's being done right now thinking about forms of accountability that can be built in both for the public and private sector. So we've seen work on algorithmic impact assessments and human rights impact assessments at the government level. We've certainly seen recommendations for the private sector to be forced to waive things like trade secrecy when their systems are going to be impacting sort of high stakes domains like criminal justice or healthcare or education. But certainly in terms of these core questions around how do you build in forms of due process, the right to appeal an algorithmic decision, the ability to see the amount of energy that was used to produce, a face modification app on your phone, or a system that labels, cats and dogs, to have a much fuller sense, if you will, of those planetary costs. That to me is a core governance question as well. And certainly at a moment of just extraordinary climate threat, it's just still amazing to me that we don't already have that. But let me turn the question to you, Azeem, because I know this is something that you've thought deeply about as well. How do you see governance keeping up with the tech sector in the coming 5 to 10 years?
Well, there are some small, I think, green shoots, bright shoots. COVID demonstrated one of them, where the genomic sequence of what was then called 2019 nCoV was available on an open source platform called Virological on the 6th of January 2020. So that's 7 days after the Taiwanese Reddit user noticed something was going on in Wuhan. And 25 days later, Moderna had produced their first vaccine that could manage that. And there was an interesting mechanism there because the genome sequence was in a participatory shared platform. And a couple of weeks ago, the NHS launched, the Britain's National Health Service launched a chest imaging COVID database where lots of participant hospitals are sharing all of the CT scans and X-rays of COVID patients' chests, and the data is available for any legitimate researcher to take and use, and then also commercialize if need be. Now, the old model of AI, that is the model we currently have today, but you and I have got sort of a quarter of a foot in tomorrow, would have had a company backed by venture capital hoover up all of the chest X-ray scans and then charge them at a sort of a generous price. So I see these little green shoots emerging, and there are different ways of organizing. There are different ways of organizing some of these resources, which takes me to that kind of question back to you. I mean, you talked a lot about algorithmic audit assessments and processes building, in a sense, on things that we already understand in law and regulation, right? Risk assessments and so on. But what are the new things that we need for this new technology? I mean, what does participatory governance of AI need to look like?
Well, this is interesting because it brings us to, I think, one of the sort of greatest dialectics that we have to contend with, which is the problem of scale. So obviously, we are talking about very large scale systems that operate by creating a heuristic that applies to populations. And while they can track forms of difference, it is about scaling what kinds of patterns can work across large scale groups. How do you actually think about participatory governance if people's response to that is to say, we don't want that system in our community? We don't want, say, facial recognition or emotion detection. That is the question that I think we have to confront now. Now, we've had some really interesting examples just in the last 2 years, really, of communities saying we'd like to have a ban or a moratorium on systems like facial recognition. Of course, Oakland, San Francisco, most recently Portland. But we're also now starting to see state by state in the US, and I think more broadly in Europe as well, attempts to have quite local shifts in regulation. That is, again, not going to scale in the same way that these systems scale. So the way in which we have, again, sort of law and policy systems that are sort of very localized, dealing with planetary scale systems, I think presents us with a real conundrum. So to me, the question is not just how do we think about participatory governance, but how do we think about that governance at scale? And certainly, I think at this point, that's an unanswered question.
Well, that's a really, really great response, and it's made me think about something that connects back to Amazon and the work of Lena Khan, who's currently going through her hearings at the Senate, and I think the point that she has made when she's looked at Amazon has been to say that the excesses of Amazon's power, and Amazon is at heart an AI company, are they're leveraged at lots of different points in lots of subtle ways, which in toto start to create problems. And one of the ones that has struck me recently, and it's sort of trivial and obvious, is that Amazon sold these smart doorbells called the Ring, and you buy a Ring, it's a doorbell, and then it turns out you've signed up to a nationwide surveillance system where you are as Mao used to have, the sort of grandmother at the foot of the apartment building whispering on your neighbors, and you don't really have an opt-out. And that is where you have that discrepancy, that asymmetry of power that I think you've just described.
Exactly right. And why the Ring example is such a useful one is to think not just about the logics of policing that operate behind it. So, of course, in Amazon's case, it had special deals with multiple police departments across the United States to give them cut price access, not just to the network, but also to be selling the Ring cameras themselves. But also the way in which these systems then interface with state-based surveillance at scale. So here, we've often thought about the difference between government surveillance and private sector surveillance. But what the Ring cameras remind us of is that these systems are completely entwined and interlaced, and that in itself represents a very different form of governance. It becomes extremely difficult to say this is where government surveillance begins and ends. And the same can be said in the military space as well. We now have such entanglement of the public and private sectors in making large-scale AI systems for the military. This is a serious challenge, both in terms of what you think you're signing up for when you get a Ring camera, but also if you are actually trying to write legislation, governance principles for these systems, is that we can no longer think in the ways where we had sort of discrete differences between the sort of public and private domains.
Why do you think these large-scale technology companies that are the last 25 years have been built around AI, why do they end up wanting to work with the public sector in this way? I mean, it's one thing to say that they privatize domains that we previously thought of as being public. So, for example, we would think of highways as being public, but digital highways are increasingly privatized. But it's one thing to have that sort of scope creep of the private sector and the market into areas where we hadn't got the market. But it's another thing to then start to entangle yourself with the instruments of government, as Amazon has done in the case of local police forces and the Ring network. So why did that second step take place?
Well, certainly what we're seeing is a large-scale capture of the commons. And governments obviously perform so many of those services that we understand as being, for an entire nation, for an entire citizenry. And this becomes a market in its own way that is open to capture. And in many ways, we could compare this to the Enclosure Acts. You could think about that sort of shift of commonly owned land into becoming private property, and the way in which so many of these functions of government, which are public functions and understood as such, are becoming rapidly privatized. Now, there's enormous profit to be made in doing that. So certainly we could think about this in purely economic terms. But I think thinking about it more broadly in a sort of historic context of how that shifts the way the nation state itself works, and how in some ways technology companies are becoming like nation states themselves, while nation states take on the armature of the tech sector. So we're seeing this sort of real blurring of roles that, at the very highest level, I think is changing our understanding of how power works.
I mean, we can spend the whole session here. I'm secretly delighted that we've got here. I just wanted to say we've got 15 minutes left, and in a few minutes we'll start to take questions in the usual way. You put up your hand and you ask a question. I will come to you, sir. Yeah. There should also be digital questions coming in from the audience on Hopin. If you are on watching, please do put your questions in. I have unfortunately broken the iPad that was going to give me those questions, so someone will find a way of getting them to me. We've been talking about this question of states starting to look like tech companies, and tech companies starting to look like states. I'm going to go off piste here. Facebook has tried to do something, another AI company, it's tried to do something clever with this. And by clever, I mean it's tried something that hasn't been tried before. And it said, look, we need some form of governance on the ways in which our processes, both human-driven and automated, operate on our platform. And what we're going to do is get a council of elders, lawyers, human rights activists, former journalists, former heads of state, and they will have oversight over some of these decisions in a way that is non-repudiable. So if they come up with a decision, we have to act on it. I mean, I love a bit of innovation. What's not to love with a bit of innovation? But what do you make of that process? There's one argument that says we need this because governments don't know how to do it, and this crosses over the sort of conflict of national laws problem that you face. Another argument is to roll to our eyes and say, oh my God, look, these tech companies are literally trying to build judiciaries for themselves. How should we think about it?
Well, first we can look at how these councils are formed. And of course, Facebook gets to decide who will be sitting on that council, and Facebook also gets to decide what will be the subject of their decision making. So far, those decisions have been primarily in the space of content moderation and in terms of banning who can be on the platform. Of course, Trump springs to mind. But as we've seen from spectacular reporting from the likes of Kate Crawford in the New Yorker and others, it's interesting to see what decisions do not come in front of the council. So of course, they don't get to have a say in the underlying logics of how Facebook's AI systems work, what type of classificatory systems are being used to categorize people, in the ordering logics of ad tech, from the sort of racialized, gendered, and ableist categories that are used inside Facebook's own classificatory systems, to the way in which they're deployed in locations where we've seen them actually create great harm. So we'd have to say that in the case of this particular governing body, its remit is very narrow, and therefore it doesn't challenge this core issue of what are the modes of production by which a company works. And that's something that I really focus on in the book, which is, we've got long histories to look at this. We could certainly look at, what happened with Upton Sinclair's book and this idea of, creating food safety laws, and that as a way of saying, let's sort of respond to a critique of the meatpacking industry in as narrow a way that doesn't challenge its underlying modes of production. I think you could say exactly the same thing is happening right now at Facebook.
Well, what do you? We're going to go to questions in a second. I want to just put two more questions to you. The first is that for all of the planetary scale use of resources, there is something that's sort of different about the AI and computing industry, which is that the performance of the underlying devices, against some measure, not its material footprint measure, improves and essentially doubles every year. And so it does create that clock speed of Moore's law, and what comes beyond Moore's law creates a challenge that people in other industries haven't had to deal with. I was just unpacked an old laptop of mine, which I bought in 2008. So that's 14 years ago. It's 7 doublings of Moore's law, which means it's 128th the processing power, give or take, of a computer I have today. That means if it takes my current computer a second to do something, it'll take that old computer 128 seconds. And it seems that there's a kind of logic that is hard to escape when you get that kind of performance change through miniaturization, which is what Moore's law has given us. That means that we have to look at the lifespan of these devices differently to the way that we might have looked at, the gas mains pipes under London, some of which are 100 years old. Have I looked at that the wrong way?
No, that's really insightful. And I think it's come about through multiple industrial shifts, just in the last 30 years. I mean, for those of us who might remember, learning how to code back in the, 1990s, you had to really think about, how much you could fit on a single floppy disk, for example. Right. And then suddenly there was this idea of expanding compute, cheaper compute, and certainly in the machine learning space that you would get these shifts in efficiency if you simply just added more GPUs. So we became, I think, quite lazy in this idea that, just bigger was better and grab more data and sort of throw more compute at a problem. You can see the same happening in terms of our sort of relationship to our devices, that these were essentially, very easily thrown away and reacquired. And I have to say, even just since the last time you and I spoke, Azeem, which was, I think, in the difference of 3 months, we've seen a complete semiconductor crisis move from being on the horizon to fully present with us, where, the ability to, say, buy a new car has now been, put back by 6 or 12 months, depending on sort of where you live in the global north, where we can expect to see shortages of, core devices that we used to just, having on tap. I think we're about to come to a complete shift, both in terms of how we think about solving problems with machine learning. We're going to have to be a lot more careful with the compute that we use, but also our relationship to our devices. This idea of them being limitless, that they should be, they should basically have designed obsolescence, so they're thrown away every couple of years. This is a terrible philosophy, and it's been underscored by, of course, legal regimes that have prevented us having things like the right to repair, the ability to open up our iPhones and fix them and allow them to last longer. So at multiple levels, at the legal level, the technical level, and I think also the sort of production level, we have to change how we're thinking about the way that we build large-scale compute, because we're already teetering on the edge of a cliff.
We've started down another route that's 10 hours of discussion between the two of us, but we're going to have to bring other people in, Kate. There's a gentleman up here, please. If you tell me the question, then I'll relay it across the question. Yeah, thank you. So the question was really about the EU and AI regulation, and I'll just summarize it as, what is the kind of citizen consultation that you think should take place as governments struggle with what the regulatory parameters of AI should look like?
Truly one of the most important questions that we can ask right now. In fact, just this morning, I was speaking with the Australian Human Rights Commissioner, who is advocating for a move to essentially including communities to be making decisions about every government use of large-scale AI, essentially moving again to the AIA model that I and others have written about. But certainly when it comes to what's happening at the EU right now, it's such a crucial piece of legislation. If we start to see this omnibus regulation pass, we need to make sure that it has true forms of accountability built within it. My concern, and speaking very honestly, is that it really assumes that notice can do a lot of work, that by saying, hello, you're currently being recognized by a facial recognition system, or we are doing emotion detection on this video call, without giving people the ability to refuse, to say no. Herein is, I think, certainly the greatest challenge, certainly for that particular draft legislation, but more generally, what will the politics of refusal look like? Not just for individuals, not just for communities, but also for entire nations. How do we start to think differently about the fact that just because a technology can be built and deployed doesn't mean that it should be? So that, for me, is the big question that we face.
So Professor Crawford has set you all homework. The essay question is, what does the politics of refusal look like? And you can frame it either as individuals, communities, or nations. Your own choice. 1,500 words for her by tomorrow, please. What I'm going to try and do is innovate. Shortness, lack of time. I'm going to get 3 brief statements, and I'm going to try to bundle them. So this gentleman here, this gentleman, and then this gentleman, please, quickly, and I'll get them back over to Kate. So the 2 questions from the gentleman over there were really about, summed up in this E.O. Wilson quote, which is, we have Paleolithic minds, medieval institutions, and godlike powers or godlike technologies. How do we go about reconciling those?
This just makes me want to be in the room all the more in order to have this conversation together. This is certainly one of my favorite quotes as well. And to me, I guess I would turn it on its head a little and say, what if we actually have Paleolithic technologies compared to what we think we have, and godlike capacities to relate and understand context and each other in so many ways that we often too narrowly prescribe. And I'm thinking here, of course, of sort of the founders of AI, Herbert Simon and Alan Newell, who used to believe and certainly argued that in some ways that computers and human minds were species of the same genus. And I think of that as one of the great kind of original sins of this field, that certainly, it has cut out so much. It reduced human reasoning to a formalism, ultimately to a fiction. And what we've learned, obviously, is that this type of Cartesian dualism, this sort of separation of minds from bodies, individuals from communities, has led us profoundly astray, not just in terms of technically how we design our systems, but also how we understand ourselves and our responsibilities to each other. And I can't help but think of how timely it is to be thinking about that in relation to the pandemic that we are experiencing and continues to rage on in parts of the world more than others, to think about our codependencies and the way in which we, in so many ways, rely on addressing these problems in context and in relation to each other. So this is a long way of saying, I think, that, you know, this tendency to separate technology from society is itself, I think, a misunderstanding of really how these systems work.
Well, that allows us to bring in the third question of the tripos that I picked up there, which was that we have obviously more than just compute. We have IoT, we have a lot of other technologies running around. And it makes me ask the question about, when did the narrative emerge that flipped our sense of what technology was and how it relates to our own capacities, and what can we actually do, if we wanted to flip that narrative around and tackle that original sin, tackle what the chairman of one of the world's largest technology companies said in a room I was in a few days ago, boldly: technology is neutral and everyone knows that. Which was a sort of had a ring of finality about it. But what do we actually do to spin that narrative around?
Well, you know, fortunately, many academics, thinkers, artists, activists have been really challenging that claim for decades. I mean, we could think about Kranzberg's law of this idea that technologies are not neutral. We could think about Langdon Winner and the idea that artifacts have politics. And certainly the work that I've been doing and that many others are doing right now is thinking about how our technological artifacts have political economies. These are frameworks that allow us to confront that myth of neutrality and objectivity, which haunts the field, and again is behind, you know, so many of the problems that we're now trying to claw back from in terms of large-scale bias in AI systems, in terms of the way in which, again, we see marginalized communities bearing the greatest costs, is because of this myth of objectivity and neutrality. So certainly I think my hope, and perhaps this is a little too optimistic for this time of the day, but my hope is that myth is well and truly out the door. The big challenges we have now are to think about how can we ensure that these infrastructures we're building do not actually increase injustice and drive further asymmetries of power and wealth, and how can we actually make sure that those systems are serving the greater good? That is the much harder question.
Well, Kate, thank you so much. I have a much more manageable hope, which is, my hope is that you will all go out and go to your favorite bookstore and pick up a copy of The Atlas of AI, which is a really fantastic book, very, very deep, very accessible, kind of perfect for a summer. So please go and do that. Kate, thank you so much for taking the time, and good luck with your just 3 jobs that you have to get back to.
Azeem, it is always such a pleasure to speak with you, and enjoy the rest of CogX. It's a fantastic day.
Thanks so much, Kate.
Cheers.